Hi, we're back to talk natural selection, and this time we're going to talk about modes of natural selection. So last installment in our diversity and evolution slides here. Okay, so we talked generally about this idea of natural selection, that these different traits are being selected for as different individuals are competing within an environment that doesn't have finite resources. And when they survive, that's good for them, but that's not only good for them, it's also good for their offspring, because it means their offspring, which are going to have similar traits to them, are also likely to have those same traits that are going to allow them to survive. Whereas if they have traits that aren't very good, then their offspring are not likely to have that same level of success. So that's kind of the overarching concept of natural selection. But now we're going to kind of get more into the nitty gritty of how it actually works to change traits of species and lead to speciation. So generally, a lot of times we think of these different modes of natural selection, and sometimes we talk about directional selection, stabilizing selection, and disruptive selection. So in the case of directional selection, what happens is there's some sort of pressure in the environment that is causing organisms that have one particular trait within the population to do poorly, while the other side of the population that has a slightly different trait is doing better. So for example, in this little population of mice, maybe this darker colored mouse is better at hiding on some sort of like basaltic landscape. So maybe there's some sort of like dark soil or dark rock that these mice are scurrying around on. And there's a variety of different mice within the population because it's a diverse population, but those with the light coats don't do as well. They can't hide as well. They're more likely to be nabbed by a predator. And so over time, what we see is that more of the mice with the darker coat survive. And so their babies are more likely to have the same darker coats than they had. And so the population starts to move in one direction. And so there's a difference to the gene makeup of that population. And then there's a difference in the kind of phenotypic or the visual trait part of that population. So that's called directional selection. Then kind of jumping over to the other side, there's another thing that can happen, which is called stabilizing selection, where we have maybe a range of traits that occur within a population because of a range of genetic makeup within the population. And maybe there's something about both extremes that's sort of unhelpful to survival and propagation. So maybe the dark mice, I don't know, there's something about their ability to camouflage or whatever that's harder both when they're really dark or really light. So having some sort of like middle, more mottled color maybe allows them to have better potential camouflage in this particular environment. Remember, the traits are always have to do with what environment you're existing in. And so what that would lead to is that both organisms that have extreme traits on one side or the other tend to not do as well, not have as many babies, and those traits aren't passed on. And over time, it kind of streamlines the population around. Still, there's going to be some diversity, but kind of a narrower band of diversity. It kind of focuses the population to having specific traits that are going to help it survive. The very specific conditions there. So that's called stabilizing selection. And then finally, there's what's called disruptive selection. And so in this case, maybe what happens is that there's a certain trait that is shared by some in a population that allows it to survive in a particular way and do well. And those that have totally a different set of traits on the kind of other side of the population also have a particular way that they can survive, but it's not the same. So maybe the darker mouse is better at hiding on a certain darker colored soil, and the lighter colored mouse is better at coming out at a certain type of day and eating a different type of food or whatever. There's some difference in the life history strategy that these two groups of organisms have to kind of rally around to be able to survive. And so over time, what happens is the mice that have a particular trait are kind of moving in the same spheres, they're in the same locations, they're coming out at the same time of day, whatever. And so they tend to start to kind of interbreed and then create a population of mice that has that particular trait. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's this other kind of separate population that started out as part of the same population that's moving in a different way. So in this case, we're having kind of like two different incidents of directional selection happen at the same time, where two different groups within the population are breaking apart and they're both moving, and they're moving in different directions because they've basically are being selected for different types of traits that are allowing them to survive in different ways. And then eventually kind of the organisms that have the original kind of more middle trait will not really be able to survive in either way. And so they'll start to die out, and then we'll start to have two different groups of individuals that have different groups of traits. And over time, this might be exaggerated so much that we end up with two totally different species that have both evolved from a common ancestor. So that's called disruptive selection. Okay, so directional, stabilizing, and disruptive selection leads to distinct lines and potentially new species from common ancestors. Okay, so another example of how this would be is that, you know, we have some sort of common population, common ancestor population, and then it starts to experience these different genetic changes due to the natural selection pressures. And as the small genetic changes start to kind of pile up over time from generation to generation, because remember, the changes that you have are likely to be passed on to your offspring, then at some point after many, many generations, the group of individuals is no longer going to really have the same genetic makeup that the original group of individuals had. And so again, that's when you might have a new species. And so that can happen both like at the same time when the original population exists, or when maybe another group within that original population is moving in a totally different way. So we can have like directional selection, disruptive selection, leading to changes in new species kind of at the same time that an older ancestor species is still in existence. Or sometimes what can have happen is we have some sort of directional selection where the whole population is moving in one way and changing its genes and changing its traits to survive in a new mode, in a new environment. And at some point, the makeup of that species is really so different than the ancestor species that we consider it a new species. So there's kind of a separation, in that case, in time between when the new species exists and the old species exists. But again, that's not necessarily true. We might have a species kind of break off a bigger population when the other population is still in existence, is basically what I'm trying to say here. And here is kind of another example of two individuals or two species that share a common ancestor. So a giraffe and an okapi, they both live in Africa, and the giraffe has kind of adapted to have this extra long neck that allows it to access certain food resources that other organisms can't, so they don't have to compete for that. This okapi, of course, doesn't have a long neck, but it has other traits. It has this patterning that allows it to be a little bit more sneaky and hide camouflage in the grass better in a way that the giraffes don't do. They're able to be a little bit more camouflage in like the speckled lighting of leaves on the tree rather than the stripy grass. And so basically these organisms both share a common ancestor, and then within that group of organisms that existed at the time that common ancestor existed, there was some sort of like disruptive selection that led a certain group of those individuals towards kind of adapting towards having a long neck, whereas other individuals moved in this direction. And so basically over time, now we eventually have two species that didn't exist before because of these different modes of selection that were acting on that ancestor population. Okay, so hopefully it's kind of starting to make a little bit of sense now. Okay, so another theme that I've brought up a few times is that, of course, a lot of times what happens is that the environment is changing around the organisms. So maybe a population of organisms had a fairly stable set of genes and a fairly stable set of traits that wasn't changing a lot over time. It was pretty successful. But then all of a sudden, something happens where the environment changes. So there's kind of a famous example back in the Industrial Revolution where there was all these like plane trees and different kinds of trees that were planted all around London and in England. And originally, before we started burning a bunch of coal and other fossil fuels, they had kind of a speckled, whitish, grayish colored bark. And so many moths that lived in that area, particularly a moth called the peppered moth, had adapted over many, many generations to be able to be well camouflaged against that kind of grayish, whitish bark. But then, as lots of coal was being burnt very rapidly, the soot started to gather on all the trunks of the trees, and they all started to turn a lot darker. And all of a sudden, this particular coloration that most of the peppered moths had was not a good adaptation to be able to survive. All of a sudden, they were not camouflaged anymore. They were really standing out. But luckily, there was diversity within the population of the peppered moths. And there were certain peppered moths that were a little bit darker than the others. And so in the past, that group might have run the risk of standing out a little bit more against the lighter colored trees. But now that the trees were darker, the darker group of moths was much more camouflaged. And so the predators were eating these white moths rapidly. The darker moths were able to survive and have more babies. And so we saw this very rapid shift in genetic and population traits within the peppered moth towards a much more darker makeup of the population because this environment was changing around them. And this was particularly possible because these moths have a very rapid reproduction and generation time, right? If you are a human and you're only having a new baby after you've got to be 20 years old or so, then it's going to take a lot longer for changes in traits and adaptations to take place. But if you are an organism that's having many rapid generations every year, you can make adaptations more quickly. And so a lot of this research on natural selection is done with these kind of rapidly turning over insects, like things like fruit flies, or in this case, these peppered moths. So the new environment changed which traits were successful and changed who was the winners and losers, or change what nature was selecting in this particular environment. Okay, so the environment is important, but there's also different kinds of competition and kind of ways that different species can go about accessing resources from the environment. Whether it's competition or predation, the way that the organisms are relating with each other can help kind of drive what traits are being selected for over time. So one common thing that happens is that resources are partitioned by subpopulations within a species. And the classic example of this is Darwin's finches. So basically, these were finches that existed within the Galapagos Island chain. And when Darwin got there, on his voyage on was it the Beagle, I think is the boat he sailed around on. He got there and he observed that these birds seemed to be fairly closely related. So they probably shared a common ancestor, but they had differences, and those differences were well tailored to the particular resources that they were taking advantage of. So they were living on slightly different locations, in some cases on totally different islands. Different sizes of islands, and those different islands had slightly different plant communities, slightly different resources. And so some finches seem to have evolved these large seeds or large beaks to deal with eating large seeds. Other birds were focusing on little buds or cactus fruits or insects. And so they had different shapes of beaks, which represented different kind of inherited traits, which related to their different genes that they inherited from their parents, based on which resources they were kind of being adapted to. So this would be kind of an example of like some disruptive selection that had occurred on the population as a whole that had led towards these different kind of offshoots from kind of a common finch ancestor. So another important idea in the context of competition and natural selection is something that's called the competitive exclusion principle. And this principle says that no species can occupy the exact same niche for long. So basically, if you have two species that are living in the exact same place and trying to access the exact same resource in the exact same way, there's always one that's going to be doing it better than the other. There's always competition that's taking place. And so the one that's not doing so well is either going to die out, so it won't be there for long, or it's going to have to adapt to have kind of a different strategy or a different set of traits that allows us to access that resource in slightly different ways or a slightly different resource if it wants to stick around. So this is called the competitive exclusion principle, and basically is something that actually leads towards greater diversity on the landscape over time. So another example of why competition is leading to diversity. And then here's my bad finch joke. So, Mom, why does brother's beak look so different from mine? I always worried you would ask about this one day. It's a secret. Don't tell anyone, but your brother is adapted. Ching. Okay, so a lot of times the thing that's leading towards natural selection is not necessarily a change in the environment, which we talked about in the example of the peppered moth, or a change due to kind of competition or interaction within species, which we just talked about. But a lot of times there is modes of speciation that are exaggerated or kind of come to a tipping point because of different kind of geographic relationships within individuals among species. So the basic idea is that you can only breed or experience sexual reproduction and mix your genes with individuals that are in your same area, right? So if you're a finch on a Galapagos Island, if you're a tortoise on a Galapagos Island, or anywhere else, you're not going to be able to successfully mate and have offspring with a tortoise that lives in an area that you can't get to. So geography is very important. And there's kind of two concepts. One, which is geographic isolation, which leads to something that's called genetic drift, which is basically just kind of like a version of directional selection, where there ends up being some acute or very fixed barrier to gene flow. So for instance, you are a finch or you are a snake or something, and you get washed in a storm out to a deserted island. And all of a sudden you're there, and maybe with a few other individuals from your same species. And now you're stuck and you can't go back and interbreed with the original main population. So you're stuck just sharing the genetic information with your kind of subpopulation there, and you may start to change the makeup of the population in that particular spot because there's slightly different environment and there's only certain genes that were available to start out with to act upon. And so you start to potentially get what's called endemic species, species that only live in a very particular area. And so you can experience some directional selection, so a change in the makeup of the population in that particular isolated geographic spot. So that would be something that could lead to a new species. Sometimes we also have geographic barriers that aren't so acute. It's not like you're on an island or you're not on an island, but maybe there's just a large geographic range over which a species exists. And so just practically, the fox that lives in Florida is not going to be breeding with the fox that lives in New Jersey. Now, there might be a species of fox that exists all across that region, but just practically, those foxes down in South Florida are going to be breeding with each other, and the foxes up in New Jersey are going to be breeding with each other. And so there's going to be some kind of limitations on the way that traits are going to be passed across these large geographic distances. So this is sometimes called a soft barrier to gene flow. And that is not necessarily a problem and doesn't necessarily lead to a change to the species of the species itself is fairly stable, right? If there's a certain set of traits and genes that are allowing that species to be successful in all those environments. But sometimes what we see is we start to have some kinds of changes to the genetic makeup of certain kind of subpopulations within the range across which a species exists. And so at some point, we might have a situation where a species on one end of the range has diverged enough from the traits and genes of the species on the whole other end of the range, so that if you picked up, in my example, a fox from Florida and a fox from New Jersey, they may actually no longer be able to interbreed to create offspring. And you may remember that in our definition, that means that they're no longer the same species. And just disclaimer, that's not necessarily true of foxes. I'm just trying to give you the concept. And so it's a little complicated though, because maybe if you took a fox from Florida and North Carolina, they could breed, and a fox from New Jersey and North Carolina could breed. They share enough similarities, but then all the way on the other sides of the ranges, they've diverged enough. So it's just kind of to illustrate that species don't all move together as a whole. It's kind of a complicated and messy topic. Here's examples of like thinking about how this would work with a little fruit fly, some fruit flies on this banana. This banana gets washed out to this deserted island. And then maybe there's a change to the makeup of the flies based on the color of the landscape, blah, 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 blah. And so we can start to see this kind of genetic drift, as we can say, happening. So anyway, that's just another example. And then to kind of go back to the example of these kind of soft barriers to gene flow across long ranges, there's something that's called a ring species, and we have this in the salamanders in California, these Encentia salamanders. And what happens is these salamanders exist within the mountainous ranges of California, but not within the Central Valley. So practically, a salamander that's living down in San Diego is not going to be breeding with a salamander that's up in the Siskiyou Mountains, the Klamath Mountains in Northern California, but it might be interbreeding with kind of salamanders that are closer to it, like more from the coastal range or more from the Southern Sierra. So there's going to be some like transfer of genetic material across populations that are nearby. And so each population shares enough genetic material with its neighbors to be able to kind of be considered the same species. But then if you all of a sudden pluck a salamander from one extreme and bring it to the other, it's really no longer compatibly able to breed. And so again, this is just another illustration of kind of our messy idea of what a species is, and shows how this natural selection is acting on these different salamander populations that kind of came from a common ancestor, but then now they're living in different environments. And so different kinds of traits are being selected for because the environments that they live in look different, and they're different. They have different temperatures, they have different predators, they have different competitors, they have different vegetation, they have different camouflage. And so as a result, they're not all, staying stable and staying exactly the same over time, but they are all experiencing natural selection. Okay, that's a good stopping point.